and more so, 50% of our workforce is deployed in agriculture. So if you ask people who are doing projects, even though we say that, there's so many 1.2 billion people, but actually labor availability is a problem because 50% of those people are deployed on farms. So it would release the manpower for industrialization much as it did for China. So I totally agree with you. We don't have to be rocket scientists. We don't have to go to the moon just yet. But if we just dealt with our agriculture by incentivizing the scientists that we have, world's largest number, I think we'd make a huge, giant step forward.
I mean, you are an experienced hand in this matter.
Well, you see, it's easy to say that why doesn't the India's private sector do any R&D? Because it's so easy to get a license and you just and then produce here in this country, use low labor cost and use all the regulations to produce in this country and then produce. But you see, people don't understand that the private sector and the division in private sector and public sector money is wasted everywhere in the world. Whereas the private sector money in America, although you mentioned about DARPA and various other organizations in America who invest in R&D in universities, but the private sector funding of universities is huge. But in the end, the private sector would want delivery. They are not going to spend shareholders' money on just giving money to the universities. That can be done as a charitable act. Okay? But unless there is a very close connection, not just superficial connection, it doesn't work. In my place, I have a turnover, it's a bear in mind, it's a university. I have a turnover in my place, 250 million pounds a year. 99% comes from private sector. But they would, in the end, expect a car or a two-wheeler or aircraft wings coming out of that that's easily transferable to the shop floor. Unless you do that, why should private sector come to you? So you will depend on public sector, and public sector money is wasted.
Let me just add that I think there is a model already in India that echoes what the Lord Bhattacharya has just said, that particularly the American private sector and in the IT field has set up research facilities here. I've just recently been to the GE facility in Bangalore, to the Honeywell research place in Hyderabad. And both of these, I think, provide models for the interests of American companies in particular, but there can be joint ventures as well. In doing research here, given the enormous human capital that exists, lower costs in some ways of doing basic research. The other half of the two that I visited is that while there is basic research going on, it's also being applied to products that are going to come out the door. GE in particular has been working on medical products that can be used in small village clinics that rely on solar energy, that do not require the sophisticated services of an ICU. So I think these are also additional ways, in addition to having a stronger private or a stronger public investment in research, is looking to the companies that can draw on Indian human capital, the IITs and others, to do their research here rather than in other locations around the world. The value of English should not be underestimated in this. The fact that we can do this in English rather than having to learn Chinese or some other language is an extraordinary advantage for India in dealing with the American companies.
I'll have one more question and then we will have to conclude, because I think I'm getting signals for terminating the conference. The other major problem we see is, because it will too many, how do I choose one? Other question that is going through underlying theme and major problem is migration to cities because of the points you are raising about labor productivity in agriculture, and what's going to happen is need for more and more cities, and China is experiencing that. Yet, we don't have a governance mechanism in which cities can be built. So the question I have for the panelists is there a change needed in our constitution, and particularly when these unique identification systems is coming in, as to how people express their voices, as to how the tax dollars get spent? Does it get spent on subsidies, or does it get spent on various other kind of basic needs? So it's an area where IITians, particularly PANIIT, who are in the policy-making domain, can make an impact. Views, please.
It's very difficult to answer such questions, but let me tell you, about 3 weeks ago I was in China, and the new president-to-be was introduced to me, while having dinner, he said to me, "Do you know we are in a terrible economic state?" And I said, "What?" "Our GDP has come down to about 7%. We got to do something very quick." I am going, while he's becoming a president, $120 billion a year in infrastructure to raise the GDP from 7% to 10%. But, you know, his main anxiety wasn't that. His main anxiety was, if people are poor and they don't get employment, the government will be in trouble. So you see, there is an ecosystem that works there, centralized, which is different from other countries, which will force the infrastructure, which will then create employment, which will then improve the productivity of their agricultural sector. They are all interlinked. If they are not, I mean, let's put it this way, your tractor business here, the Tafe or Mahindras make huge sums of money selling tractors, and it's going up exponentially. So therefore, productivity is also going up exponentially because of the way the market is going. So it isn't an easy thing to say that if we do this or do that, it's got to be a totally integrated, centralized policy or regional policy. If not, nothing will happen.
To answer your question, I think we need both subsidies and investment in social and physical infrastructure. I'm reminded once Mother Teresa was told tauntingly by a bureaucrat that, you know, you should be teaching them how to fish rather than giving them fish. And she said that the people I deal with are so feeble and deprived that they are unable to hold the tackle. But once I have given them enough strength, then I will pass them on to you so that you can teach them how to fish. So therefore, for some poor people, very deprived people, I think a direct subsidy, and what Nandan Nilekani is doing is, I'm really proud of an IITian who is doing a thing like this. So, but I agree with you that as we rationalize it and reaches the right people, then the money should go into developing common assets and investment in physical and social infrastructure. And also, I think our country needs to develop such industry that uses agricultural raw material as inputs, such as food processing industry, such as wood-based industries, such as herbs-based industry, so that agriculture, value added to agriculture based industrialization takes place. And then you would find that you can industrialize areas not only around urban centers, but in near rural areas where the raw material is available. So it is really a matter of visualizing conceptually a strategy for India. and then placing incentives in place so as to make that happen.
If I could just reflect a couple of observations. I think one of the things certainly the urbanization is emerging in large numbers. A reminder to the Americans who are here that there are now at least 45 Indian cities that have 1 million people in them and growing. But those cities also represent an opportunity for developing manufacturing and other facilities, perhaps out of the major areas where infrastructure or power have become more difficult. One of the things that I have certainly seen since returning to India is the growing power of the states, the willingness to compete for American investment. American businesses are very good at looking at which states offer ease of setting up businesses, provide some kind of education for expatriate children, provide transportation networks, and I think that will encourage additional looks at cities outside of some of the major metropolitan areas. I also think that there's a role for the IITs and other education institutions in India to develop real specializations in dealing with transportation engineering, infrastructure engineering, sanitation engineering, power grid management, things that are going to be absolutely critical to the urbanization of India and to being able to continue to expand manufacturing, to expand the IT sector here in India.
Thank you very much. I know all of you have lots of burning questions because the topic is so interesting and heavy, but we don't have enough time. But I would request you send your questions to the organizer, and maybe we can figure out how to answer them going forward. And the second thing, I would not say that I'm taking on the responsibility for answering it. At least you'll know how intensely you are feeling those questions, and some of the questions probably have easy answers. The second thing is I'd like to thank Yogi for wonderful comments and wonderful institution that you have built, Lord Bhattacharya for thoughtful presentations and inspiring us to think about education institutions that can get private sector funding to the extent of 250 million pounds and be able to do private sector driven actual research. I think that's a great model for many of the IITs to go after the growing private sectors like ITC and others. And thanks, Ambassador Paul, for inspiring us to come up with lots of apps and inspiring us and helping start, you are here as an American ambassador. I know how much American educational system has helped IITs and continuing to help in cross-border research collaborations as well as other collaborations. So looking forward to your help, both in STEM as well as in education. So, and ladies and gentlemen, thanks for giving us a patient hearing.
I would request our speakers to give us just a minute more on stage. May I request the immediate past director of IIT Kharagpur, Professor D. Acharya, to please come on stage and give away the speakers. If we could have you on stage just for a minute. There are mementos for you. To Dr. Chatterjee, who chaired the session. Ambassador Pal, Mr. Deveshwar, and Lord Bhattacharya. Thank you so much, everyone.